Welcome to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, or CXC 2021. Our 4-day celebration of cartoon art couldn't happen without our partner organizations, to whom we are grateful. CXC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our annual festival, free to the public, relies on corporate and grant support, as well as individual donations. We are grateful for their support. Visit the Support CXC link on our website to find out how you can help us create meaningful connections between the people who make comics and those who read them. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the Eastern Woodlands tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. We hope you enjoy this event. Don't forget to visit our virtual expo at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org and keep the conversation going in our Discord channel, which you can find at cartooncrossroadscolumbus.org/discord.
Hi, I'm Sydney Heifler, and I'm so excited to have Roberta Gregory, Trina Robbins, and Robert Triptow here for our panel, Life Underground, a discussion about comics with Roberta Gregory, Trina Robbins, and Robert Triptow. So I'm just going to introduce our guests now. Roberta Gregory has been creating comics for a long time. She was a frequent contributor to women's comics, Tits and Clits, and gay comics during the 1970s and 80s. She is best known for her Bitchy Bitch character, star of 40 issues of Roberta's Naughty Bits series published by Fantagraphics, as well as television animation and stage productions. Roberta has published a number of other comic books and books, including Winging It, Artistic Licentiousness, Follow Your Art, and True Cat Tunes, and she is a frequent contributor to the Graphic Canon books. She continues to be creative, including appearances in anthologies with more bitchy comics planned and her lengthy prose trilogy in Winging It spinoff Mother Mountain. A collection of her out-of-print comics from the early days is being talked about. Award-winning historian and writer Trina Robbins has been writing books, comics, and graphic novels for over 50 years. She has written and drawn comics from Wonder Woman to Barbie. Her 2009 book, The Brinkley Girls, the best of Nell Brinkley's cartoons from 1913 to 1940, also published, and her 2011 book, Tarpe Mills and Miss Fury, were nominated for Eisner Awards and Harvey Awards. Her all-ages graphic novel, Chicagoland Detective Agency, The Drained Brains Caper, first in a 6-book series, was a Junior Library Guild selection. Her graphic novel, Lily Renee, Escape Artist, was awarded a gold medal from the Moonbeam Children's Books and a silver medal from Sidney Taylor Jewish Library Awards. Trina's most recent book is The Flapper Queens, Her History of Women Cartoonists of the Jazz Age, which just won an Eisner. And yeah, let's all clap. In 2013, Trina was voted into the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame. Last but not least, Robert Triptow is a writer and underground comics fan who got to live in San Francisco and be one himself. He edited Gay Comics and co-edited Strip Aids USA and has been seen in underground and alternative cartooning anthologies, including Bizarre Sex, Young Lust, Real Girl, Juicy Mother, as well as contributing to more mainstream publications like the Shirley Jackson Project, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce this, a Minion Yidden. He now lives in Hawaii and is currently working on the complete Gay Comics, which I'm very excited about. As I said, I'm Sydney Heifler, the moderator for today's panel. I am a current PhD student at The Ohio State University in the Department of History and a comic book historian who specializes in romance comics. I am so excited to be having this discussion about underground comics with Roberta, Trina, and Robert, and I'm thinking maybe we should just start off by asking everybody to explain a little bit about how you got into underground comics. And who wants to go first?
Alphabetically, it should be Roberta.
Let's see. Well, I got into comics because my dad did comics. When I was a little kid, he was writing stories for like Dell Comics, and then he got into drawing them later on. But we always had comics in the house, so that's how I learned to read. So I started writing and drawing my own when I was barely old enough to write and draw. And except I didn't think I'd ever like make comics professionally because women didn't do comics back then. I mean, you looked at all these comics, and when I finally got, started reading like DC comics and Marvel comics with people's names, they were all men's names except for Marie Severin. So I just kind of thought, well, this is just something I'm doing for myself. So I basically just kind of wrote these stories that I thought nobody else in the world would possibly enjoy except weird old me. And that's kind of what I've sort of done with my whole life. And more people seem to like them than I thought. So that's kind of cool. But let's see, I was doing comics in college and I stumbled across underground comics like women's comics and Tits and Clits. And it was very revelatory to see, wow, you know, women are publishing comics, they're doing stories. I mean, a lot of them don't draw much better than I do, and there they are in print. So it was very, very inspiring to think that, you know, anybody can do comics. So I started drawing my own comics. Like I wanted to do LGBT themed comics, which nobody else was doing in the 1970s, or very few people were doing. So that was kind of me doing things I wanted to read that nobody else was doing, and it kind of took off from there. I mean, I'm still doing things that I'd like to read that nobody else is doing.
And Trina, you're next.
Sure. I'd like to comment that, Roberta, I believe your first published comic was in women's comics. Am I correct?
Yeah, issue number 4. Yeah.
Uh-huh. I mean, women's comics, we had been criticized. We had been called heterosexist because we had no lesbians, but no lesbians had sent us any work. And then suddenly we got this wonderful story from Roberta. It was a takeoff on romance comics, and it was perfect. And, you know, so we printed it. Of course we published it, you know, and not because she was a lesbian, but because it was good. So, okay, about me, this is my first published comic from the summer of 1966. Actually, I think it was the fall of 1966. I had just come to New York from Los Angeles in August of 66, and I went to the East Village Other because my friend Eve Babbitts was one of the editors, managing editor, and I met the staff and the publisher and the editor, and I drew this, and I didn't even draw it for publication. I simply drew it, and I went to bring it to them, just as a kind of a statement, you know, and nobody was in the office. The office was closed, so I stuck it under the door, and then I phoned, and I said, "Did you get my comic?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, it's going to be in the next issue." So voila, my career was started. I drew for the East Village Other. They were, by the way, underground newspaper. They were the big underground newspaper in the Lower East Side in New York. Every major city had an underground newspaper. So except I drew, except for where?
Salt Lake City had none.
No, really?
No, well.
Oh, well, that's sad. But you survived. But anyway, so I was drawing for the East Village Other, and it still had not occurred to me that you could actually do comic books because nobody was doing them. They were just doing comics that were appearing in underground newspapers. And then in 1968, I took a month off, winter of 1968, February, took a month off and went back to California. And when I got off the plane in San Francisco, some friends met me. In those days, you could just, you know, you didn't have to wait outside. There was no security. So they just met me, and without even saying hello, they handed me a copy of Zap #1. And it blew my mind. It was, oh, wow, you can do this in a comic book. You don't have to just do it in newspapers. And that was, you know, it's amazing that none of us had thought of that until Robert Crumb did it. I mean, that's just, why didn't we think of it? Well, we just didn't. So that was the start of underground comics. And my first underground comics were published in Yellow Dog, which was being published in Berkeley from Print Mint. And I just kind of went on from there. And along the way, I discovered that, you know, because the thing about underground comics was you could do whatever you want, that what the guys wanted to do in those days was extremely misogynistic, violently sometimes misogynistic comics. And I would say rape and torture and murder of women is not funny. And they would say, you have no sense of humor. This is, where you would get them saying women have no sense of humor. Well, no, we don't think rape is funny, So at this point, I had moved to San Francisco. We're moving forward now. We're in 1970. And I discovered that the underground scene, the underground comic scene, was a boys' club. They weren't inviting me into their books. They were extremely, I had become a feminist, a woman's liber, which is what they called it in those days. And they were incredibly threatened by women's liberation. It got back to me, sometimes things got back to me, that one guy had actually said, here comes Trina Robbins, hide the knives. So that's when I started working on the staff of It Ain't Me, Babe. I was doing their covers, and that's one of the covers. And I was also sometimes doing the back covers. And because I was working with these women, I started feeling stronger because I had their moral support. And I decided I would do a comic book, an all-woman comic book. Now you can show the cover of It Ain't Me, Babe. And that was the very first all-woman comic book in the world. And it was all, I produced it. I produced it, I edited it, I did the whole thing. I did the color separations while nursing my daughter, Casey. This was 1970. Okay, in between, I was doing other comics. I don't think I showed any of my other comics. But then in 1972, okay, for It Ain't Me, Babe, I had to find women who drew and say, how would you like to do a comic? The only woman who had done comics before was Willie Mendez, who was a friend of mine who was also living in San Francisco. She did a large part of the book. I did the cover, she did the back cover. She did an 8-page story inside. But I produced the book. So 2 years later, 10 women got together and produced the first issue of Women's Comics. That's not my art. The art is by Patricia Moodian, who was the editor of the first one, who in fact got us all together. We all converged on her cute little cottage in San Francisco, 10 of us. And that was 2 years after I had to find women who drew and have them do a comic. And it moved on from there. We were a collective. We met once a month. With the first issue, we called for submissions, and we got them. We got them really quickly. Women, Roberta, like you had said, that you thought, well, women don't draw comics because there weren't any. And then you saw comics by women and you said, wow, women do draw comics. That's really what happened with It Ain't Me, Babe, was that women looked at this and went, oh, women do draw comics, and sent us comics. And we would sit there on the floor with all these submissions and pick the ones we liked. So we were definitely a collective. I'm not sure where to go after this, because at that point I was a selling cartoonist. The guys never published me. The original group of guys, the clique. Later, by the late 70s, there were other men who didn't know I was a feminazi bitch and liked me and asked me to be in their books. And that includes Robert, who was editing gay comics and invited me. When I got the first letter, when I got Howard Cruz's famous letter, I thought it was wonderful, but I didn't do anything because I was a straight woman. And I thought that this book this is where gay cartoonists should have their say. But Robert invited me in. And Robert, that was such an honor, to be in gay comics.
Okay, well, my history as a cartoonist is really strange. I was like a lot of kids who read comics as a little kid. I loved Little Lulu. Every underground cartoonist I've ever met loved and was influenced by Little Lulu, which was the one non-boys comic, which is interesting. I read Silver Age DC, Superboy and Superman and all that, but totally lost interest in comic books by the time I was 13 or 14. So my first exposure to undergrounds, I was a journalist. I was a newspaper guy, and I was in a school field trip. I grew up in Salt Lake City, and we were on a field trip to Brigham Young University, the big Mormon school in Provo. And we were there for a workshop, and I immediately skipped the classes because I realized early on that they weren't teaching us anything about journalism or writing. They're trying to teach us how to be obedient. So I completely ditched those classes and went and hung out in the student union bookstore at Brigham Young University, where of all things, I bought 2 paperbacks. One was Jules Feiffer's Passionella. I'm a big Jules Feiffer fan. And the other one was a paperback collection of college comics of the day, but I think it was Wonder Warthog and Captain Crud. And that was my first exposure to Gilbert Shelton, who to this day is my favorite out of the old school boy cartoonists, because he told great stories and wasn't necessarily out there to outrage you. So ironically, my first encounter was at BYU. And I read those and I loved them. It was great. Never thought of them again until I was out of school on my own for the first time. I was 18 years old. I was taking acid for the first time in February of 1971 when somebody shoved that same issue of Zap Comics that Trina saw at me, and I was looking at R. Crumb's Hamburger Hijinks, which just completely blew my mind. To this day, it's still my very favorite Crumb cartoon. And I hallucinated. I can do that too. So I started drawing comics to amuse my friends, and I started carrying a notebook around filled with a lot of underground type single panel cartoons. Very much, those are my acid days, so there was a lot of acid influence, very much cosmic notebook drawings. And I drew comics to amuse my friends without ever thinking about publishing them. But a couple of years later, I went to work for the Salt Lake Tribune, and in the art department, there were a couple of artists, Neil Passy and Mark Knutson, who had both contributed to the only underground comic book to come out of Utah called Aardvark Comics. And we all worked at the Tribune, and we all had lots of free time on our hands while waiting for work to come in. So we started doing this sort of competition where we would draw cartoons, pencil cartoons, and then post them on a pillar by the art department. And some of them were really, really inspired. Neil Passy especially was brilliant. To this day, Neil Passy is the best artist and the best cartoonist I have ever met, but he chose not to do cartooning. So I got involved in underground cartooning more seriously because of Neil, because at that time in Salt Lake City, you could not find them. You couldn't find underground comics in Salt Lake City anywhere at any time anyway. But I would go to the local head shop in Salt Lake, the Cosmic Airplane, and I have to say to the guy, Neil Passy sent me, and then he'd bring the comics up from under the counter so they wouldn't get busted. And I started collecting them. Then I became insanely a fan of underground comics, to the point where I'd go to San Francisco on vacation and spend all my vacation money the first day on every underground comic I could find, and then I'd be starving while I was there. But I'd bring them back to Salt Lake, and all of my friends centered around me on them, and they all loved underground comics. We were this strange little comics cult in hippie Utah. It was very fun to be a hippie in Utah because we got away with murder. So all my friends very much focused on things like, well, one of my friends was called the Snoid, and he's still called the Snoid to this day because he sort of resembled Crumb's character, the Snoid. They were all very much fixated on the Hungry Chuck Biscuits, the Freak Brothers. The ones that were turning me on more after the first Outrage cartoons by, the taboo breaking cartoons were, then I started picking up women's comics and Binky Brown and Meets the Holy Virgin Mary by Justin Green. And those are the ones that turned me on because it was more than just trying to shock and outrage people. They were telling stories about life. And I found that a lot more attractive and thought, well, I'll do that. But I have to admit, by the time I was 24, 25, I was over it. I was a newspaper man, and I could draw, but I knew there was no real money in it. It was just a hobby I did. I drew cartoons to amuse my friends, cartoons that will never be published to amuse my friends because I was trying to be an outrageous hippie. And then just through sheer fate, I'm going on. I was living in Los Angeles. I'd worked for The Advocate. I'd been heavily involved in the gay movement. I knew, all the characters in the movie Milk. After Harvey Milk was assassinated, I ran away to LA to get away from it all, and then found myself running around with movie stars. And Charlene Tilton of Dallas was a friend of mine, and yet I was still drawing these outrageous cartoons. And the people I knew, they were very resistant to it. Why don't you draw something commercial? So the more they said that, the more outrageous I drew cartoons. So the first thing I finished was a cartoon with a character of mine named Nowhere Chick, who I realize now it was sort of sexist, but Nowhere Chick was based on myself. And I did this cartoon about Nowhere Chick practicing fellatio on a doorknob, and it got published in Bizarre Sex. So that was the first thing I drew that got published. Went back to San Francisco and met other collectors of undergrounds. And through them, I met Dory Sita and Dawn Donahue, who really gave me major encouragement. So I started circulating things around to the publishers, and they all said, underground comics are done. The day, Ron Turner told me so many times, the day of the staple-bound comic book is over. So I kind of gave up on it again. I just, I had other things to do. And I was writing for a gay newspaper when the first issue of Gay Comics came in, and the editor took one look at it and threw it in the trash because editors of papers tend to have lousy taste in cartooning. So I fetched it out of the trash and convinced him to let me do a review of it. And Howard Cruz loved the review, and he wrote me a thank you note and asked me if I knew people who contribute to the second issue. So I had these little one-page cartoons that had been rejected by all the gay papers in town. So I sent those to Howard, and he published them all. And then a couple of years later, they needed a new editor, and they wrote to me and asked me if I wanted the job. And since they were asking me, I knew there was nobody else who wanted to do it, so I said yes. And here we are now.
Well, that's great. So
any questions?
I had a couple of questions. Both Trina and Robert mentioned Howard Cruz and his sort of influence on underground comics and gay comics. And I know from previous interviews I've read with Roberta, she's also mentioned him. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to talk a little bit more about Howard Cruz.
Well, I'd like to mention the fact that he was inspired by women's comics, to do the content of, gay comics. I mean, I remember him saying that was one of, his main inspirations was seeing the women's work in women's comics.
I know that when I got that famous letter, my first reaction was, realizing that Howard was gay, which, by the way, was an incredibly brave thing to do, to come out, to send these letters to everyone, which was basically a statement that he was gay, because the underground comic scene, as I have mentioned before, a lot of the guys, they were sexist, they were homophobic, they were racist. I mean, it was incredible, and yet he made this statement. But my first reaction was, I should have known he's such a nice guy, because he really is a nice guy.
Well, as a reader, I've got to say, when I discovered Howard Cruz, it was after I'd already been reading women's comics, and the taboo breaking by the straight male cartoonists had become very tiresome. I got tired of it. By the time of Zap #4, which had incest and hardcore graphic sex, and Felch and Snatch and whatever those other titles were, they were always as filthy as they could be, and it was funny for a while, but you don't keep on doing the same thing over and over again without getting boring. So when Howard came along, he was so different, completely different from every other male underground cartoonist. His stories were thoughtful, and they were about life, and they were about situations in life, and they were more like women's comics than anything else in the underground. And that was what I found the most attractive. So when I was given the chance to, if they'd offered me the editorship of Zap or something like that, well, I don't know if I would have done it, but it would have been long forgotten by now. But I did gay comics because it was a positive thing, and it was Gay Comics was the first humor publication for gay, lesbian, bisexual, all the factions. It was the very first non-pornographic humor publication in history for those groups, and it was similar to women's comics in the same way, in that there are all these voices waiting to be heard and a big audience waiting to read it. But the establishment cartoonist was not at all interested. So I still think that is the greatest achievement of gay comics and women's comics, is giving voice to people who were being ignored.
And I think, I just want to say, I think that there's real value in what you said, because I feel like in some ways it's still giving voice to people, because people still come into comics through these underground comics that are no longer being published and made, and they find them at cons, or I found about them through Trina's Girls to Girls, and we still identify with them, and it's still like a way to like feel like we're being heard, even though they're not being made anymore. So,
Robert, I have to say that if I had been asked to edit Zap, which is just a ridiculous concept, but if I had, I would have immediately invited in all the women and all the gay cartoonists.
I couldn't hear all you said, but it sounded like it was nice.
it wasn't a very Trina statement.
When we invited Trina into gay comics, I have to admit there was a certain, Trina was very well known, and I thought, oh, maybe her readers will come in and read gay comics. But at the same time, I knew that you would give us sensitive work, because women's comics and gay comics went hand in hand in my mind. And because there were so many lesbian and bisexual women who were interested in women's comics, it was the same audience to a large degree, and we were very conscious about bringing women into gay comics. There were so few women, lesbian cartoonists when I was editing, that I wanted to get as many women as possible, and I also didn't want to be exclusive. The whole point of it was to be inclusive, and so we call you our token fag hag, but I thought that was a valid conclusion.
I am a fag hag.
Straight women
I am
and
proud
straight
of being a fag hag.
Yeah, I'm glad there was, Trina got invited in. I mean, at the beginning, there were just like so few. I mean, it was actually kind of exciting, because after like maybe getting 2 pages in an issue of women's comics, maybe, all of a sudden I could do like a 6-page story in gay comics. I mean, I was all over the first few issues, just because Howard wanted to have equal representation between women and men, which was very radical for that, for 1980. And there are just very few women doing LGBT comics. So at the beginning, it was nice to be able to do something more than like 2 pages. So that was, but for a while. But then, like, I think Alison Bechtel, didn't she kind of debut in gay comics, I think?
I published her. I think she already had made a name for herself by the time I published her. But, I wanted to have it be 50% men, 50% women too.
Right.
There just wasn't the material. I think Andy Mangels was the first one to actually achieve that, and that was much later when it was more mainstream. So
I just want to comment, Roberta, the reason that we only had like 2 pages. I'm sorry, Robert, are you still talking? No. Okay. The reason that
we also
we're losing you.
We have to mention the other female cartoonists who were such important contributors to gay comics. Lee Mars and Mary Wings, at least.
Yes.
Mary Wings is a real pioneer of lesbian cartooning, and Lee also. I was. They were in gay comics before I was. So, and to a larger degree. I'm very pleased that I've gotten to know these people, because I went from being a fan of all these. I knew who all of you were before I even moved to California. I knew you all really well from your cartooning, or as much as I could get from that. And I've got to say, I've told you this before, but this is really true. I learned nothing about feminism from living in Utah. Very, very little. And I didn't read Ms. Mac or anything like that. So your comics, yours, Trina, and yours, Roberta, and Mary, all Sharon Rudall, all the others, I learned more about feminism from those comic books than I ever learned in day-to-day life in Utah. And my friends did too. So
I just want to comment that the reason you only had 2 pages, Roberta, is that we had so many contributors, and we tried to publish them all, and the result was we were limited in how many pages we could do. You knew that, yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was. I mean, it was a treasure trove of women artists. Some
Yes.
I haven't seen their work since. I mean, it's like there's a lot of contributors that they did this wonderful work and then just kind of disappeared from the scene. So it's like really, it's an archive. I mean, it's that complete women's comics compendium that Fantagraphics put out. It's like it's a landmark.
It is. It is.
It is. Before we move on from the topic of women's comics, I want to wait. Sorry, did you have a comment, Robert? Is that Robert?
I was just going to say, it was no surprise that a lot of people would, do worthy works of note in women's comics and then move on and never be heard from again. Because let's face it, none of us have ever made any really money. No money at all from underground comics. It's a hobby, kind of got a lot of attention. So I think it's worthy that people did things at all to begin with. And only the most dedicated and stubborn people like you two and a few others could stick with it down to the years. Because let's face it, even when you're published and you have readers and all that, you still have to deal with a lot of crap in this business. Flaky publishers and bookstores that won't carry you, and sometimes social discouragement, condemnation to some degrees. I mean, in Utah, for instance, the only book of mine that's ever been available there was the last thing I did, Class Photo, a minion you could order there, and the Shirley Jackson Project. Everything before that, nobody there has ever seen, and my family and some of my friends just think of it as being pornography just because it was gay and underground. And they will not look at it no matter what. So you have to be kind of a rebel and continue to be a rebel to create work for what is called underground comics, because we're outside the societal norms to begin with. But I don't know about you two, but I just never got very much encouragement outside of what I heard from other cartoonists.
Well, unless someone wants to answer Robert's question about getting attention outside of from other cartoonists, does anyone want to answer that first of all? Okay, I was kind of wondering if we could touch on some of the stories in women. Oh, I'm sorry, Robert.
I'm the only one from Utah, so maybe I'm the only one of us who got that response.
Being from Utah might engender that. But I was wondering if we could touch on some of the stories in women's comics, some of the groundbreaking stories, such as Sandy Comes
Out. Yes. When I did that, I wasn't thinking in terms of, wow, I'm doing the first comic about an out lesbian. I just did it. I did it because I wanted to tell the story of Sandy, who had been my roommate. And I thought it was a good story. And it turned out that it was the first comic about an out lesbian. So that's nice. And I did it with Sandy's approval. In fact, thank you. I basically, Sandy approved of everything I did, and I gave her the original pages. There's a real story about that because I didn't know it, but Sandy died young. She died of cancer. She had a son, though, and I thought the pages were just lost. But then I found her son. In fact, her son, for a while, lived on my block, on the same block I live on, and he had the pages. So he should keep the pages, because they're about his mother. But I have asked him, and he has said he will make really, really good scans of the pages so that I can print them up and they will look like the originals, and so that I can exhibit them, because I'm always getting requests from various exhibitions, always getting requests to show those pages.
One of my professors here actually mentions it a lot in our history of sexuality seminar. So there are people here as well who are interested in that.
What does he say?
Oh,
What does he say?
he keeps trying to. He's like, where is that located? What archive is that located at? Is that at the Billie Ireland? And no, it's not. But so we, of course, Billie Ireland would love to have any sort of scan of that, but we do have your California Girls fan mail, I believe.
That's good.
I love Sandy Goes Out, and it had major impact. And I mentioned it in the book collection I did of gay cartooning in 1989 because it was historically significant. But I was speaking of historical significance. A few years later, when the first same-sex marriages happened at City Hall, Roberta had a hole for a backup feature in Naughty Bits, and so she invited me to do it. So I did that as my topic, the same-sex marriages at City Hall. And I was able to directly quote Sandy Goes Out, the joke about mistaking a woman for a man. I actually had it be somebody mistook a woman for Gavin Newsom. As my favorite cartoon I ever published was that particular cartoon, and I got to quote it quote Trina's work in it and publish it in Roberta's comic book. So that's my favorite piece.
Roberta, I wanted you to discuss some of the work that you sent me scans of. There are a lot of great scans. You sent me one of Bitchy Butch and Dynamite Damsels, and then also it looks like Super Dyke. So like whatever, those all sound amazing to me. Whichever one you would like to discuss, I would love to hear about.
Oh, sure. Well, Dynamite Damsels, that was, I mean, like Trina and I were saying, there was fierce competition for pages in women's comics. So I kind of decided, well, maybe I'll just do my own comic book. And it was started out, I had a little strip in the college newspaper, Frida the Feminist. So I kind of expanded that into the adventures of Frida Phelps, the feminist who later comes out. And I published it myself with the help of Lynch, with some advice from Lynn Chevley and Joyce Farmer, who were publishing. They had their own publishing company. I was in Southern California. I was not in the San Francisco scene at all. Nanny Goat Productions. They published Tits and Clits and Pandora's Box. Some of the other underground comics I discovered. I think Tits and Clits was like neck and neck, I think, with women's comics as being like the first women, or something like that. It was exciting times back in like 1971.
They actually came out 2 weeks before women's comics, and we did not know each other. We had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea what we were doing.
Wow.
And,
yeah, that was
I remember
1971.
Yes. No, 72. 72. Okay. The second meeting of women's comics, someone brought a copy of Tits and Clits and said, look what's coming out of Southern California. And what was so weird is that it was all California. They were doing it in LA, we were doing it in San Francisco. No other state was doing this.
That is interesting.
Well, anyway, yeah. Right. So, like I say, it was a collection of my Frida stories, and then Super Dyke. That was just a story that I just kind of did. I mean, I just kind of sent a few scans of what I had available, just because my studio is like a furnace right now. It's on the top floor, and it's like in the 80s. So my scanner is like, not plugged in, and it's kind of hiding. So I just kind of grabbed whatever images I had on my laptop, But Super Dyke, that was kind of fun. That was I actually did more Super Dyke stories that have never been published just because, I don't know. I mean, I drew, a few like maybe 7 or 8 page stories with like Zipatone on it, which now looks horrible. So they'll probably never be published. But that was something I have a lot of stuff that I've done that's never been published. So, who knows. But anyway, yeah, and then I think when Tits and Clits became a anthology, I did a few stories for that. I did some stories for women's comics. And yeah, it was kind of exciting. I mean, because I printed 10,000 issues of Dynamite Damsels with all the money I had in the world. And that was a tiny print run back then. I mean, back then, what I think people would print like 50,000 copies. That was like a standard print run of like
Not
an
of Underground Comics, they didn't.
Really? I think I
Oh,
remember.
no, for major comics like Marvel
maybe.
and DC.
Mhm.
Underground Comics, no. There were only 10,000 copies published of It Ain't Me, Babe. And then
really?
it sold out, and he did the second edition. And as you know, there were two different covers. I mean, the color on the two covers.
Mhm.
Because I had thrown away the color sets of the first edition. And then Ron Turner said, can we have the color sets back? We need to reprint. So I just redid the color sets in a different color. So that's how you can tell which is first edition and second edition. And also for women's comics, there were only 10,000 copies published.
Anyway, yeah. So, and I pretty much sold them through Last Gasp. That was like kind of the distributor. And back then there was a network of women's bookstores, thanks to feminism.
Yeah.
And I'd send a copy off to I'd have a list of women's bookstores, send off a copy and say, hi, this sells for $1. If you send me like $6, I'll send you 10 comic books. And I got rid of a ton of them that way. So it was just a totally different time. I mean, it's, it's history. I mean, it's amazing. But yeah, like I say, the real excitement came, though, I think, with gay comics. I mean, like some of the stories I published in gay comics, I could really do some interesting things with them.
Gay comics never published more than 10,000 issues, copies an issue. Never more than 10,000, but it never sold more, half of that, except for the first few issues. And many issues basically just rotted until in storage until they had to be sent to recycling, because the publisher didn't really know how to promote it by the, because Underground Comics dealt, they were delivered to the public in only a couple of minor ways, primarily through head shops at the beginning for Zap and all those hippie-oriented things, and then feminist and gay bookstores carried gay comics and women's comics later on, which may be why they had longer, print runs than the underground, other undergrounds.
But
most of the undergrounds were really sort of like throwaway, one shot only.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the other undergrounds.
But women's only had
how many issues? 15.
We had, we lasted 20 years, but there was that 7-year hiatus. I don't mean 15 issues sounds kind of right. Roberta, can you remember?
Of women's comics?
Yeah.
Oh, I think there were more than that. I think, didn't you get up to like 17 or 8?
I think you're right. Yeah.
I should go grab the big box off the shelf and look at them right now.
That weighs a ton. But we never published more than 10,000 copies.
Let me ask Trina and Roberta if you have the same perception about women's comics in your early comics as I have about gay comics. Does it seem to you that those titles are better appreciated today than they were when you were publishing them? Because I know when gay comics came out, it was sort of like, we put out an issue, and crickets, the gay community at the time was not all that excited about gay comics. Just, the comics collectors, which were a micro, faction within the larger faction. But today, now it's like everybody treats it like a big deal, which was kind of a surprise to me when I first encountered that sort of revisionist attitude. So is it the same way with your older comics? Do you think people are appreciating them more because of the historical impact that seems to be more long-lasting than
I don't think so. I think that
people might have thought at the beginning?
Women, judging from how many submissions we got, immediately women were thrilled with women's comics. At last, a comic that was all women, they were thrilled. We did get some criticism from the extreme feminist world, the world of really extreme feminists. And as I say, they called us heterosexist. They probably also called us racist. But again, we had not received any submission from women of color.
Well, one thing I want to say is like now we have social media. I mean, of course we're seeing, getting feedback. I mean, back then, like, you might get a fan letter. I mean, you might get a review in the underground paper or something. But I mean, now there's like, I mean, there wasn't even really much social media when I was doing Naughty Bits. I mean, I did all 40 issues, and I think there wasn't Facebook. I don't think there was Facebook back in like 2002, or not many people were on it. So I think a lot of it is now this stuff is just reaching a wider I mean, it's reaching a cosmic audience. I mean, with via cyberspace. So I think it's wonderful. I mean, I can't wait to see the complete gay comics. I mean, I think that's gonna just go off like a,
Yeah.
yeah, go off like rockets, I think.
So much work. I hope you're right, because there's a lot of work to do with that. I've got to say that social media, the internet, has made a huge difference. I sometimes think that we might have just all been forgotten as a little footnote to cartooning to begin with. But, you mentioned fan letters. When I was publishing gay comics, editing gay comics, I got no fan mail, which surprised me because Howard Cruz seemed to have gotten a lot. I later found out that if something came into the publisher of gay comics and this was personally addressed to me, he just didn't send it on to me. But I didn't get a fan letter about gay comics until many years after I quit, and it was it was an email I got from Yugoslavia was breaking apart. It was the Balkans War, and it was somebody wrote me it was right there in the middle of the war zone, and wrote me a fan letter about gay comics. This was like 1995 or so, which I thought must really be a fan, from Sarajevo or wherever he was writing from.
Robert, what you said about editors, publishers rather, because we got fan letters, but what happened? We got fan letters when we decided, because I was living in this house because I owned it, and so it was a permanent address. So we used it as the address for women's comics. But before that, we had used the address for Last Gasp. And I remember getting a letter, and this guy was so critical of everything in women's comics. And he said, and you say, send us mail, but I sent you a letter and nobody ever answered. And it turned out he had sent it to Ron Turner. And I wrote him back immediately and said, we never saw that letter. The reason I saw this letter that you sent is because you sent it to my address. And he immediately wrote back and said, oh, thank you so much. I really loved the art in women's comics, and, just did a complete turnaround. So I wonder if that didn't happen with your fan mail too.
Well, when gay comics was still being published by Kitchen Sink Press, Dennis Kitchen did forward to me a handful of fan letters, in response to Howard Cruz's editorship, and I don't think he sent me much more after that because he was no longer the publisher. Gay Comics had a very strange relationship with its second publisher because Bob Ross was simply not a comics person. We knew nothing about it. I don't even know why he bought the title. But, we were always in constant conflict because, I think he expected Gay Comics to turn an immediate profit. And of course, he never made a dime off of it. So, maybe when he got letters that they were addressed to him, he just tossed them into the trash right away because he was a sort of reactionary fellow. Maybe.
I just wanted to say, as a historian, I feel that all of your work is very important. And Robert, when you were talking about how those comics would sit until they would like rot and have to be recycled, I died a little bit. But I do. I was like, no sources. But I do agree. I think social media has definitely gives creators nowadays a bit of a more direct impact with their fans, but also your work and gay comics and women's comics and all the comics we've discussed does get talked about on social media today still quite frequently, as I'm sure that you're all aware of.
Well, social media is great in terms of us all getting a reputation, but it's terrible if you want to cash in at all. I mean, the copyright violations, it's like, forget about copyright ownership. It's been a burden for me because I've had to do copyright battles down through the years with people who all assume that if it's in print, it's, up for grabs. So, after a while, you sort of give up because the copyright violations, on the internet are profound. And it's really hurt the ability of all creators, writers, photographers, artists, to make any money from it, which is, none of us are expecting a lot of money from it, but you want that. It makes a difference. It actually makes a difference in your self-esteem when you're doing cartoons. If people value it enough to at least pay you a few dollars for it.
All I ask is credit.
It's mine. It's free because you are.
All I ask is credit. I mean, from the books that I have written about women cartoonists, if you go to Google and you Google one of the women's names and you go to images, you'll see all the images are credited, but never credited.
We could go back to Arkram and ask him how he felt about Keon Truckin being ripped off and published all over the country and him not getting a penny from it. So it's not a new story at all.
No, of course.
It is not. Okay. So two questions. I had two more questions, if that's okay. And you can take whichever one most interests you at this moment. But I wanted to hear a little bit more about Strip AIDS USA, because we had been mentioning that before we started, and so I wanted to hear you both talk. Well, all three of you, if you want to talk more about that. And then two, did you all you had all alluded to this? Did you all kind of know that you were part of a moment in history, like a really important historical moment, when you were working on these comics?
When we were working on them, I don't think any of us thought we were historical. It was just something we really wanted to do. Now I think we know we're historical. I mean, I'm on lists. I discover this usually on Facebook that someone says, look, the list of the 10 most important women in comics, and Trina Robbins is on this list. They don't tell me that I'm on the list. I find out because somebody puts it up on Facebook. About Strip AIDS USA, I was in England, and I met Don Melia and Lionel Gracie Whitman, and they had put out a book called Strip AIDS, and it was full of cartoons of comics, and the money was going to AIDS causes. And I looked at it, and I thought it was wonderful what they had done, but I saw that the comics themselves were just comics. They weren't about AIDS. They were simply comics. And I thought, well, this could be done better. So when I came back, the first person I asked was Robert, because, how can you do something, an anthology to make money for AIDS without asking the editor of Gay Comics, And then we got Bill Sienkiewicz, because someone told me that Bill had been talking about doing something like this. And I called him and said, well, join us. So he got the mainstream cartoonists, I got the women and the underground, and Robert got the gay cartoonists. And I phoned Ron Turner, who, wound up being the publisher. And before I could even finish asking him, he said yes, which was very lovely and encouraging.
Yes. That was a wonderful time. That was a great project.
I think both
really
of us
proud
are very
to be associated with it.
Yes, that's just what I was going to say.
Time. You want to talk about, if we were aware of historical significance, I was very aware that gay comics was historically significant, because otherwise I wouldn't have taken it on. I mean, I had contributed some panels, some pages to the first few issues, but if you look back at the issues, I was not in issue number 4 of Gay Comics at all, because I thought, okay, I'm done with this. I was moving on. And then they offered me the editorship, and I realized, well, they're offering it to me. Nobody else is in line for the job. And I thought, this is important. It should continue going on. Within a year of me taking on the editorship, I was losing friends to AIDS. And, I normally don't dwell on that period of my life very often, because it was so dark and sad. And if I start thinking about it too much, I start getting unhappy. But I'm very proud that I did it. And Strip AIDS USA was like, the crowning achievement, because the cartoon I did for it was, I created fictional characters, but it was based on me and the situation I was in my life. And it was a hard time. I had to be positive and like the cheerleader for all the cartoonists. Let's put out this next issue of Gay Comics when I was really like sick and exhausted and in misery and mourning the whole time I was doing the editorship. But it was worth doing because that was the time and that's what needed to be done. Other than that, I did cartoons about same-sex marriages, which I thought were historically significant, but it echoed my newspaper man side, where I was reporting on events around me and also making fun of them. It's sort of funny. Recently, somebody in the community was trying to use my work without paying for it, and they were trying to flatter me, saying, "Oh, you're a community builder and you're such a leader and you've helped unite gay people in the past and all this stuff." And I thought, I didn't do any of those things. I was a smart mouth, snarky person who wanted to make fun of everything that I saw. And, that was still pretty much just what propels me. And so I had no idea at all about being a community leader, or building bridges or empowering people, past the fact that, gay people needed a place to publish. But sometimes you get these labels without even trying, I guess.
I think the work that you've done is very important, and Strip AIDS USA is just so groundbreaking, especially considering the stigma that was around AIDS at the time. And but Roberta, we have not heard from you on the question of either Strip AIDS USA or if you want to talk about, or also if you had any sort of awareness that you were in part of a very important historical moment.
Well, like I kind of said before, I was basically just kind of doing stories I wanted to read, like my stories in gay comics. One of the first stories was about, it was sort of gay stories that people weren't really telling. Like I think in issue 1, it was about a woman, a single mother. And then I think it was issue 3, I did a story about an alcoholic woman in the gay. That was a big deal in the gay community. I think there's an image of that, in I think I sent, it's one of the images I sent. And then I think I did a story about a transgender character that was back in, I think, issue 6, I think. That was the early 80s. Nobody was doing comics about trans people either, so a lot of that was like based on real life. But like I say, I don't think I was doing first so much as, ooh, I haven't read a story about so-and-so. I guess that means I've got to do it, and back then I had the time to do it. And, Gay Comics, bless their heart, they published it. So, it's just kind of what's going on. I mean, I think Trina said, I don't think we had any idea that we were doing something, historical or significant. We were just trying to get work out, our work and the work of people who we admired, to readers in the way that was done back then, which was, you print up a bunch of comic books with staples and try to get them, physically in all these different locations, across the country or in or around the world or whatever, like comic by comic. And we did it. And like I say now, you can find this stuff on the internet with the, with a few keystrokes. It's another world. Yeah.
It is another world. I do love that you've all kind of said that, I was creating the comics that I wanted to see, and, that you didn't know if anyone else would like them, but it turns out a lot of people have liked them and still continue to like them. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the legacy of your work and of gay comics and women's comics and underground comics in general.
Well, I realize now, I don't think, we definitely didn't think of ourselves as this in those days, but I realized we were an art movement, and I realize now the historical significance, of course, but when you're doing something, I think that when Picasso was trying out Cubism, I don't think he thought that it was of historical significance, You do them, as Roberta said, you do them because nobody else has done it, and you want to do it.
or the story grabs you, and even if you don't think that highly of your own work, because I have self-esteem issues, but if I get an idea, it's like I'll move mountains in order to get that idea down on paper. If I finally get that bug. I don't think anybody who does anything quality does it with the audience in mind. Otherwise, it would just be television.
Yeah.
So I mean, Trina, when I first met you in 1982, I was already very aware that you had done something grand with your life, and I was in awe of you at the time. And Roberta, if they ever put out a 1,000,000-page volume of your collected works, people's breath will be taken away by the sheer scope and breadth of the subject matters you've done, because you've done everything from science fiction and fantasy to domestic drama and satire. You've done everything I can possibly imagine, except for maybe pornography.
There's some of that too.
So these two women especially, I think, are amazing. It should be a chapter on each of them in the annals of cartooning.
I definitely agree. I think all three of you are amazing. Although as a grad student, I definitely understand the lack of confidence. But I just want to also comment, because I don't think it's been touched upon but not really talked about in depth so far, is that these comics didn't just matter to the comic community, or at least they don't just matter to the comic community now. Like, they had broader implications in other communities. And it's because when I research romance comics, it's like I'm looking at romance comics in a very specific comics history context, and not so much how they were kind of influencing other communities. So do you feel that your comics went beyond the immediate comics community? Does that make sense?
Women's comics certainly did, because the women who contributed to women's comics, really a lot of them weren't comics readers, because what was there in comics for them? I mean, a bunch of guys in capes. Women aren't really interested in guys in capes punching each other out. Those books were being done for boys, not for women. So a lot of the women were not comics readers.
We all read Little Lulu, though.
Yes, of course. Well, we were comics readers anyway, weren't we? I mean, I certainly was. But I was not really interested.
But, neither was I. It's funny, because I wanted to be Superboy when I was 12, but I also read Little Lulu. I mean, even Crumb was influenced by Lulu, and that was, even though it was written by a man, it was in some ways the first feminist stories I ever saw, Little Lulu. I love, I was a comics collector. I was a fanatical comics collector until I finally achieved the complete run of Little Lulu, at which point I thought, I'm done with this. I stopped collecting after that. I stopped buying comics after I got the last Lulu. I bought the complete Crumb when Fantagraphics, put out all of his works, and there was a certain point where I lost interest, because he stopped doing stories about the world and started doing stories about himself, and they were not nearly as interesting. And I never got that sensation from any of the women cartoonists. It's sort of funny, though. I've got to say something about Crumb, which sort of says, you're talking about the impact outside of the underground. A few years ago, Crumb illustrated the book of Genesis. It was a great big deal, and all the mainstream people and the Christians all loved it, because our Crumb has finally redeemed himself. And I thought it was the most boring. It was beautifully illustrated, but it was so boring. It was
he just did it straight. He did. He did.
A little story
really...
I can tell those. I went to the port. Yeah, I went to the art museum in Portland, because they had all the original artwork on display there, and it was, he had God depicted in there, and then coming out of the museum, there was a guest book that you could sign, and some other cartoonists had been there before me. They'd done drawings, and they're like, "Love your show, Bob," and things like that. Well, when I was a young hippie in Salt Lake drawing comics for my friends, one of my primary characters, because it was outrageous for Utah, was God. I did God comics. They were never published because they were terrible, but I did this version of God. So I went to this museum exhibit, and there's this guest book. So I drew my old version of God in there in the guest book, saying, "Remember me?" And well, a week later, a friend of mine wanted to see that same exhibit, so I went back there. I says, "Oh, you've got to see the drawing of God I did in the guest book." When we got there, that page had been torn out of the book. And to this day, I don't know whether it's because somebody came along and they were either outraged by the fact that I to a cartoon character, or somebody who said, "Oh, here's a drawing by Robert Triptow. I'm going to collect it." So someday maybe I'll find out. And then when I did class photo, I resurrected God. I brought back that character of God for one panel in class photos. So I sort of felt like the circle was complete by then. You know, my love of Crumb was gone, you know, by then, but I was able to make fun of him and, you know, and God at the same time. I'm definitely going to hell.
We'll be there. We'll be there.
We'll all be there. But okay, so Trina, I believe you were saying something about Roberta.
What was I saying?
I don't remember, but you were saying something. But I know Roberta was talking about. And I'm trying to, because I got so wrapped up in what Robert was saying, I now forget what we were talking about. But Roberta, do you remember what we were discussing about?
I don't know. I think I said I still read Little Lulu. I mean,
Oh, we all read Little Lulu. Yeah. I have. Mm-hmm. I sold my Little Lulu comic books because I have the reprints, and you can look at the reprints without the pages falling apart and crumbling. So I sold all of the Little Lulu comic books.
I've got a stack of the Dark Horse reprint ones in black and white that I got at the library sale for like $1 each. And
oh, that's nice.
When I'm down in the dumps and got the blues, I take a bubble bath and read Little Lulu. I mean, that is my therapy, is take a bubble bath with my soggy, beat up Little Lulu books, and she has kept me sane so many times.
And of course, we founded an organization. We formed an organization in the 90s called Friends of Lulu. And that was because comics at that point, women were invisible in comics. The only place they were visible was as these bizarrely built sex pots in comics drawn by guys, women with incomprehensible bodies. You know, that it's like the guys had never looked at a real woman. And that was women in comics. It was the worst time for women in comics. So we formed an organization for women in comics called Friends of Lulu. And it was based on Little Lulu, who was always trying to get into that boys club that had a sign that said no girls allowed. You know, and that was us.
Yeah, ironically, I wanted to join Friends of Lulu, but it was no boys allowed. So
no, boys were allowed.
You know, Lulu brought me back into cartooning because when I was living in with Starlights, I went to a garage sale in LA and bought a big box of Little Lulus for $20. It was a great fun, and Underground's in there too. And it was reading those Little Lulus that actually got me interested in cartooning for the second time. So, you know.
Boys were allowed in
I don't know about
Lulu.
John Stanley, but we have a lot to thank Marjorie Henderson Buell for.
So
yes,
boys were allowed in Little Lulu, or in the.
There were boys allowed?
That's what Trina just said.
Yes, in fact, we had kind of a bit of a fight about that when we formed it, because I didn't want boys in the club. I wanted only girls, but they wanted to include boys too, and there were more of them than me, so we included boys.
I see. So I can. Oh, sorry, Robert, finish up.
I respect that.
You respect that, yeah. So I have been given the notice that we're coming up on time, which is sad because I'm really enjoying this conversation. But we have about an hour slot, and I think we've hit that. But I wanted to say one last thing. I don't know if you realize, just to like really hit home the impact of underground comics, like. They're everywhere. They're and they're in high fashion now. Like I think we all know about Trina's work being used by Prada, but also Moschino's. Yeah, I've been hunting down some of those pieces, by the way. But you know, Moschino also uses some underground comic work, and you know, I just want to point out it's everywhere. You're all amazing. Your work is amazing. Still has lasting impact.
So, do you have some of those Prada clothes?
I've been looking for them. And trying to bid on them and get them, and I so far have failed.
I didn't see. All I saw when I looked up Prada fashions, all I saw on eBay were like some T-shirts. Very disappointing.
Oh no, I can show you where it is. I'll email you,
good.
Trina. I know where all the clothing is. I am known for finding all the comic book fashion that I possibly can. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyway, Robert, I think you were gonna say something before I went off on my fashion conversation.
I don't know where we're at because I'm only hearing like every other word from you guys. So repeat the question, please.
Oh, it wasn't a question just so much as me telling you all that you're like amazing and that your work is still very important and everywhere, including in high fashion. So.
In high fashion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
I just clothes for one of. I'm hoping that Complete Gay Comics will help a lot in terms of recording the legacy of gay, lesbian, transgender, all the isms. There are so many factions now, but I'll just say gay comics and mean everybody. But I'm really hoping that having the Complete Gay Comics in print, it went from 1980 until what, 1995 or something, and maybe later, and covered a lot of ground and a lot of changes within the community. And it started out full of angry political diatribes and coming out cartoons, and then went through the period of heavy satire from me, and then mainstream escapism from Andy. So I'm hoping that people will understand there's a lot more breadth to underground cartooning as well as gay cartooning than the stereotypes might think. Now, if you're to go back and republish all the underground comics that were out there in the 60s and 70s, maybe 20% of it would be really worthy of your perpetuating, because there was a lot of garbage out there, a lot of drug-oriented things by people who could not draw, but there was so much that, so many things that were said that, voices that were given a microphone, and things that people wanted to say that were not being said in other art forms. Feminism being a great example. You could sing songs about it, you could give speeches about it, you could write short stories, whatever, but none of them had the impact of seeing like somebody's experience boiled down to a few pages of words and pictures, because it had a more immediate and visceral impact. And to me, that's what the underground is all about, is the ability to do something outside the norm, break the conventional molds, tell something that is real to you, even if it's just a hallucination on drugs. Or give you a chance to, share and express your most outlandish fantasy with the world that needs to be stimulated that way. That was the appeal of it to me then, that it was free. Cartooning was free. It wasn't a matter of, we're all going to break taboos together. It was do whatever you want. And that's what I did. I mean, to the best of my ability. So, and I know that's true of both of you as well.
Very much. Well, I think that is all we have time for. I think that was a great conclusion to our conversation, Robert. So thank you. I don't think I could have said it better. And I think that's.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and agreeing to be on this panel.
Sydney, thank you for inviting me.
Oh,
bye all.
Yeah, I appreciate. Nice to see everybody, even virtual.
Yes.